Before starting, I limit the floor to our three speakers. My duty is to just give a really short introduction of them. So let's start from Ivan Faiella, who is a senior economist at the Bank of Italy, which is the Central Bank of Italy, and he was also in charge of coordinating the G20 task force for sustainable finance. He has major collaborations with the Italian Observatory on energy poverty, and there's also a lot of publications, of course, dealing with the issue of energy and environmental analysis. Then we have also Harriet Thompson, who is who works at the Birmingham University in UK. She teaches global social policy, and as you maybe have seen from our website and webpage of this event, her analysis contributed and inspired some of the policies adopted by the European Commission in the field of energy during these most recent years. And then, last but not least, I would say Stefan Buzarowski. He already collaborated with us some years ago in one of the editions of our International Summer School of Regulation of Local Public Services. He teaches human geography at the University of Manchester, and he was also among the founders of the European Observatory on Energy Poverty. So we are all pretty sure that these three excellent speakers will help us deal with the many complexities involved in the issue of energy poverty. So let's start. I immediately leave the floor to Stefan Buzarowski. We have three main rounds of questions. The first question I will start with is simply related to the analytical concept, the definitions and the measurement tools that today are used and applied across different countries and different national cases for defining and understanding the size and entity of energy poverty. So what are we talking about? What are, in your opinion, the best indicators to describe the phenomenon, both from an objective and a subjective viewpoint? You can share your screen, and thanks again.
Thank you, and thank you for this kind introduction. It's just delightful to be here with such a range of distinguished speakers and in such a well-known and established forum. I'm really happy to also be sharing a platform with Harriet, who, together with whom we established the Observatory under a contract for the European Energy Poverty Observatory under a contract with the European Commission, and it was running until recently. It's now in the hands of the new Energy Poverty Advisory Hub. So I was going to speak quite generally today, I think mostly just to get us talking and opening a space for discussion. And you asked me what energy poverty is and how we can measure it. It's something that's been covered quite extensively in the literature. So I will talk about some of them, let's say, some of the more social foundations of this idea and why we need to think of it and how we can think of it conceptually and what that means for policy. I do have a screen to share, so 1 second. I just only have one or two slides, but I thought maybe it's, can you see me now? Can you see the screen? Yeah, good, okay. So thanks. I should say the work that I'm currently doing is in a range of projects. One is the CRES project. That's a project called Centre for Research Energy, so Centre for UK Energy Research and Demand. I always forget what it's called, but it's fuel and energy poverty in the UK's energy transition. We also have a Horizon Europe project called NPOR, which is around private sector households, and we also have another project called Poverty, which is under the European Regional Development Fund. And this project Engager is something that Harriet and I are involved in, and it's a network of experts and practitioners. It's very big. It's around 200-300 people now. And really the aim is to provide a talking forum, a space where you can exchange knowledge, produce insights, and policy relevant, also scientific insights on energy poverty. And that's some of the work that we're doing feeds into the discussion today. So when I think about what energy poverty is, I've been trying to use a definition that has 5 elements to it. and it's seemingly quite a simple definition. And my goal here has been, and not just me, but others working in this field as well, Saskia Petrova, Harriet as well, Caitlin Robinson, University of Liverpool, and many others. I think our goal here has been to basically try and develop a conceptualization of energy poverty that doesn't split us between the global north and the global south, or for that matter, Europe, North America, and so on. And we know that there are different intellectual traditions and also different strands of knowledge, and owing to a whole range of factors coming from historical to colonial to what have you, through which these terms have evolved. But in my view, we actually need to be coming up with a term that starts from the consequences of the problem and then actually describes what's happening, and from there then starts to explore the causes, because we can go very far if we start looking at the causes. People have said it's a range of things, but then those things are caused by other things and so on. So you can go very far deep into some of the structural reasons for it. So just very simply to describe what this definition, for me, what it involves. And I'm really glad to have seen this definition being used in many ways now by a whole range of international institutions. Not the least, it's embedded in how the European Commission and the European Union more broadly see energy poverty. And you can see that through the recommendations of the European Commissions, but also in a range of directives. So the idea, first of all, is that we focus on the home as a primary unit of analysis. We focus on the domestic domain and anything that connects to that. So we don't really look at public buildings. This has been one big problem. People tell me, oh, well, you know, we should look at schools and we should look at hospitals. Yes, but that's a different problem to energy poverty. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but here the focus is really the domestic domain, and it's such as a private problem that's not always easily detectable. The second element is the notion of energy services. So we're looking at instances where energy services are curtailed for some reason. So people are not getting enough of these energy services. And energy services happen everywhere universally, whether it's the north or the south or anywhere. You still need energy services to live and to thrive and to function. So those are things like heating, space heating, lighting, cooling, things like cooking, and basically all of the benefits that energy provides. But these services, and I think this is the thing I want to highlight, are hybrid in their nature. So they involve a social and a technological element. They're not purely the energy that arrives at the home, but they have to go through a series of conversions through which reflect infrastructure efficiency and so on, to get to a useful form that then can be consumed or demanded by a person, by a household. So we're looking at basically whether those energy services exist or are curtailed, or how they're being used and so on. I'm going to skip this middle bit, which I think is the key aspect. And I'm going to focus on this element called being able to secure energy services. So it is often noted, people say, oh, well, you know, in the global north, energy poverty is something about, it has to do mainly with money, with low incomes. So that's why an affordability dimension is added to it. And they say it's the global south, it's the lack of infrastructure. So people don't have the right infrastructure. So it's a question of access. So the goal here is to go beyond this access affordability binary to go on to the question of security. And indeed, in the US, energy poverty is actually called energy insecurity. So it's simply the inability, if you are a household and if for whatever reason, and that reason isn't simply cannot be reduced just to being affording something, or for that matter, having the adequate infrastructure, if you're for whatever reason unable to secure that level that you need, you're in energy poverty. So in other words, this element here is not just about income, it's also about infrastructure and so on. And so that can then mean that you might be above the income poverty line in the global north, but if securing what you need puts you below the income poverty line, you then become energy poor. And then there's the kind of really interesting element for me, which is, I'm not going to talk about inability, because that's another debate that I don't want to open. But I want to talk about this question around what is adequate. And this is for me the key question in this whole debate. Because I think you can say that this thing of needed, adequate, sometimes call it basic, minimum, it's a question of what you put there, is really important, because you can really debate as to what is adequate. There is a level of energy that people have to have in order to survive or to be healthy. And that's a kind of biological or maybe material level of energy services. So you can't, if you're in your home and your temperature is for a prolonged period of time is below a certain level in winter, or it's above a certain level in summer, you will be physically unwell and you will suffer poor health or potentially death from these consequences. So that is almost like a minimal level of temperature. But then beyond that, there is a social level that essentially people require in order to thrive, in order to be able to participate in society. And I don't know how much you're familiar with the capabilities approach, but this whole idea, this whole definition is tightly linked to the capabilities approach. So here the idea is that what is a socially necessitated level of energy is really what allows an individual to function, to be integrated in a given society. And that is a matter of the social contract. It is not, it's a relative question, and it's decided by what is an acceptable or required level for a certain society to function. Therefore, we cannot have universal for that definitions beyond this level, because then we start to get into the nitty-gritty of the social contract in every society, and we start to get into the politics of it. And indeed, this is a very political question, as poverty always is. The final thing I want to say, and I apologize if I have spoken for too long, the way I see this, I often wonder if we should be using the term poverty. In a sense, what we are really talking about is a form of material deprivation, which has, of course, a very strong income component, and it can be defined, if we narrowly think about it, as an income-based phenomenon. So whether you are energy poor because your income doesn't allow you to participate in all of these things that I discovered, or you will become energy poor because your income will decrease below an income threshold, relative or absolute, if you participate in these activities as you require. That can be linked to income. But I think there's an even broader element, because sometimes, and maybe Harriet will show this, there are instances where your income is fine and your energy efficiency is fine, but you simply are in an infrastructural situation. And we've seen this in Sweden and in very developed, whatever that means, countries. So where in fact people are energy poor through setup of infrastructure, and there is no solution for them to get warm, to attain these services. So there's an element to this which always pushes me beyond income. And I think therefore the approach of defining this as energy insecurity is a better one, as opposed to energy poverty, because energy poverty then ties us to thinking about it as an income poverty subset or connected to income poverty, which I think doesn't fully reflect the realities of this condition. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for already broadening the perspective and also for suggesting maybe an alternative potential title for next discussions on the issue. I would now pass the floor to Ivan Faiella in order to see whether there are some points to be added to enrich the discussion already. And thanks also, Stefan, for using not so much time, since we had to address other key points during this afternoon.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be as complimentary as possible to Stefan's presentation. I'm trying to share my screen here, and The point I would like to focus on is exactly the measurement of it. Can you see in the slides? Is measuring energy poverty. I'm sorry, I will be mostly focused on Italian data, but that's just because it's the data that I know most. But let's start with Stefan was saying. I mean, let's imagine that now we have to move from a space where we have to have a definition of energy poverty. So the definition is, as Stefan underlined, I mean, I don't have enough money, or I have issues in providing that some basic energy needs. Maybe this is due to the fact that energy prices are too high. These are energy prices in Italy. It's for transport, for heating, and electricity in real terms. And this is energy expenditure. And you can see, you know, how there are these spike, and this is just electricity and heating. And then you have to decide, for example, your domain. Are you thinking about electricity and heating that is more or less covering 96–99% of households in a high income country, or you want to have also private transport on board? I mean, this is going to make a difference because this is going to restrict your domain, because, for example, in Italy, there is 25–30% of households that they do not have expenditure for transport. So that's important, and it's going to make a difference. So you see that you have a given pattern because of prices, a given pattern because of expenditure. And, you know, expenditure mix up a lot of stuff. It mix up energy use, that maybe is constrained by infrastructure, as Stefan stated. That means it depends on the kind of fuels it's easy for you to access. It depends on prices, as we said. It depends also on your preferences. Maybe you like to have a very warm house, so you have a higher energy expenditure for heating, but that's just your choice. It's not that you are suffering from some kind of stress. These things is going to be even more difficult when you look at the same number that is over here. This is the fraction of total expenditure that an average households invest for heating and electricity. You see it's almost 5%. This is 2020 data, the last data of household budget survey in Italy. And, you know, it's mostly, I think that the legend is wrong. I mean, it should be mostly heating and less electricity. Then you can have the same information, but in a sense, on the x-axis, you have how much you are poor or rich. So this does mean more or less that the 5 is a tenth of equivalent expenditure. So it means I take all the households, I take their expenditure, I divide it by a kind of measure. It's like the number of members, but take into account economies of scale, and then I rank them on the basis of this ability for them to spend. So the number 5 is more or less the mean, is the median household. So on the left you have poor households, on the right you have rich households in terms of expenditure, and you look at the same share for electricity and heating, and you see there is a difference. For example, if you look at electricity, you can see that very poor households spend as much as 4% just for the electricity, while very rich households spend less than 1%. So this is going to have a difference, and you have also how this curve was different compare in the how this schedule changed in the last 10 years. So you see that all the schedule for electricity moved up more or less uniformly. So in 2020, almost 5% of the poor households was spending almost 5% for electricity, compared to more or less 2% for the median house. So almost the double. So this is going to make a big difference. So an increase in energy, in electricity price, like the one that we are seeing these days, is going to affect more these guys over here. No? Look at the heating. It's even more interesting. You see that it's a less steep curve, but you can see, for example, again, that you have an higher share for poor households. And if you compare 2011 with 2020, you can see that the situation worsened for the first tenth, while improved for the other. So that's just an example that you have prices, you have energy use, and you can have a median estimate, a mean estimates, but this story, beyond that mean, you have a lot of things going on. So the situation is different across, according to the characteristics of the households, in particular, the availability of their economic resources in terms of income or in terms of expenditure. That's a scheme that we have from a paper with Luciano Lavecchia of 2014, and we were trying to have a kind of a taxonomy of possible energy poor indicators. So if you're thinking about very low income countries, you have energy access infrastructure, the one that Franco was mentioning before, while if you are thinking about middle income, high income countries, it's more about regarding more vulnerability, affordability, like Stefan was underlined. But then you can have subjective measures, like, I mean, inability to warm adequately your dwelling. No, that's subjective because it's up to me. And again, you can have a kind of bias here because it depends on your preferences. Then you can have something that we can define objective, that's a kind of measure that I showed you before, because it's based on some kind of survey data. It is based on income, it's based on expenditure. All those possible, indicators have pros and cons. For example, if you're using income, this is more affected by the business cycle. If you're using expenditure, it's less affected by business cycle. You can have the issue of measurement error because these are survey data, so are imperfect, are just a part of the reality we are observing. You can see here in the same paper, we try to do a lot of measures and look at the picture of how many energy poor households we have in Italy. And you see you have a very different, very heterogeneous picture according to the different indicators. And I don't want to go into details, but if you're interested, you can, I can send you the link of the paper. The indicator we are using in Italy is a kind of mix of if you want, a relative indicator and absolute indicator. I can skip this one. I don't think it's important. It's important the results. More or less, according to this indicator, we have that around 8% of households in Italy are energy poor. It's a fairly stable share, as you can see from this graph, and increased after 2015. And again, according to this indicator, we break down this indicator according to the part of Italy or the kind of municipality, just to show you again, given that behind the mean you have a lot of stuff going on, as I said before, you can see over here there is a lot of heterogeneity. For example, there is the phenomenon is really definitely, it's more important in the south and the highlands, where there are more in general poor people, poor households, not energy poor, but poor in general. And it's affecting less, for example, big municipalities, towns compared to small town. Just again, to give you the flavor that even if you're using one measure with all the issues that Stefan rightly underlined before, I mean, these things is going to, you really have to know that this is a rather complex phenomenon. So you should complement this information with other information. This is we try also to have a kind of estimate that is based on what Stefan was calling these basic services. How you can do that? It's kind of an absolute poverty measure. You try to estimate what are the minimum requirements according to the kind of households, to the kind of dwelling, and also to the climate conditions that you need to have a fairly let's say, acceptable level of eating, for example, in terms of gigajoule, in terms of energy you need to be healthy, to go to school and to work and to stay at home safely. Then you put a price on the on how much does it cost to buy this bundle of eating service. And let's see, define a kind of minimum bundle. And this is we've done this in another paper with Luciano and Marco Borgarello for different kind of households located in different parts of Italy. And this is a kind, you can spot, you are trying to avoid to have the preferences involved in the indicator. In this case, this indicator, it does not depend on your preferences. Maybe you are in the northeast of Italy and you like to spend 3,000 euro per month. It's up to you because, as I said before, it's a matter of preference. But you know that according to this measure, if you are in the northeast of Italy and you are single, less than 35 years old, and you cannot afford to spend 600 euro during the year, you know that you cannot buy the minimum service in terms of eating, just to show you practically what you can try to do. These are the indicators that were used in Europe. I mean, now there is a kind of, if I may, kind of a mess, because we don't understand where the Commission wants to go with in measuring energy poverty. I think it was really a pity not to have anymore the EPO of Alive and Kicking. We worked a lot as a Italian Observatory on Energy Poverty, OIPE, with Ariet and Stefan, and we really hope that we can work again with them. But I mean, they are working, but I see that there is a bit of a mess at the moment. But when there was the energy union, the indicator to measure energy poverty was, unfortunately, I would say, a subjective indicator. So it was the kind of indicator asking, are you paying regularly the bills? Can you afford to warm your home? With Luciano, we showed that the numbers, at least for Italy, of this indicator are just crazy, in terms of time variability. That does not make a great sense, honestly. And I think that Italy, there was a year that Italy was having a share of energy poor household greater than Bulgaria and Romania and Eastern countries. It makes just no sense. Italy and Greece as well. So just to show you, I don't want to put too much confusion, but just to tell you that that's measuring this stuff, it's from one side, I think it's critical, because measuring every indicator is key to design policies and to see if the policies are working or not. At the same time, it's difficult. And so we have to recognize that it is difficult. My take, and I close my speech here, is that we really need to embed in Eurostat data an energy poverty indicator. I would really love to have these things embedded in the social inclusion indicator, a kind of complement. Now we have the share of jobless households, we have the risk poverty rate. I would like to have some kind of information on a kind of indicator on energy poverty, that is also providing the policymaker with the right tool to design its policy. Sorry if I was too long.
Oh, thanks. It was. I think you spent the right time we agreed on before today. So I would ask Harriet to jump in the debate and adding her viewpoint based on her experience, and maybe also complementing again these different epistemological, I would say, approaches to such a complex issue.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much for the introduction. And I think what we've really seen from both Stefan and Ivan's interventions is that there's this huge kind of multiplicity of definitions and metrics, and quite a lot of wider contestation that's happened, particularly within Europe, but kind of worldwide around, what is kind of the one definition or the one metric that we should use. So for me, it was good to see Stefan kind of go into the definition in detail, because that is my go-to definition, is the one by him and Saskia, because it does explicitly link the concept to the local kind of social, the context is really centered within the concept there. And there isn't a limit on the kind of energy services that are in focus. And I think this is really important because it is such a multi-dimensional issue, and it does look different in every single case. And I'd like to just share a couple of slides to kind of illustrate this. So hopefully everyone can see that okay. For the European Energy Poverty Observatory, myself and Stefan commissioned a series of photo essays across Europe to really highlight some of the human dimensions of energy poverty. So there's a URL, can't speak today, there, and also a QR code. So you can see the full kind of range of different case studies. Partly it was motivated by trying to challenge some of the misconceptions that exist around energy poverty and some of the kind of ingrained assumptions we have around which regions of Europe in particular are most vulnerable to this problem. So as Stefan alluded to, Sweden does have quite a lot of issues, despite this kind of imaginary of the country and kind of being wealthy and very progressive in terms of energy policies. But what we found is that when you kind of move away from the main city areas, and particularly when you move into the north of the country, you'll find quite a lot of small kind of scattered villages. And these are really vulnerable to failure in the energy infrastructure. There's been kind of a historic lack of investment in that infrastructure. And this one village we visited in December 2017, they had 35 power outages in just 1 month alone. And so here we can see Lars and his wife, Margareta. They're reindeer herders, and they're often away from home on trips for quite long periods of time. And they store all of their kind of produce in freezers. And the problem they had was they had a power cut while they're away, and all of the meat was lost. So there's a huge kind of economic loss to that small business. But there's also wider issues within the region of, you know, the way that our only kind of indigenous group, our Sami people, are treated as kind of a forced displacement from their lands to make way for kind of significant hydropower investment. So for us, this was really about challenging some of those preconceptions and opening up kind of new conversations about the different faces and different aspects of energy vulnerability. So we also met people living in Hungary, and this is an area where Stefan in particular has done a significant amount of research over the years. And here we met a family, and they face unbearably hot summer conditions. So this particular family live in a high-rise concrete tower block. They're quite high up beyond, you know, where there's any kind of natural shading. There's no kind of trees nearby that reaches them. So often it's exceeding 30 degrees Celsius inside, sometimes in the hotter months reaching 40 degrees Celsius. So for this family, they really described to us that they're just trying to spend every moment trying to avoid the heat. So they switch off all the electrical equipment, switch lights off, anything that might produce some sort of additional heat. They just want to have that switched off. And I think when you're working with such diverse contexts, and these are just 2 examples out of thousands we could pull just from Europe alone, and you know, you can see that it's a huge challenge to actually think about how we measure that, and it becomes evident that it's impossible to just have one indicator that captures it adequately. So instead, myself, Stefan, and many people do promote this idea instead of using kind of a basket of measures or a suite of different indicators. So I'll just very briefly show, sort of Ivan alluded to this set of indicators that we managed to agree with the European Commission. It was a bit of a struggle, to be honest, to even get these kind of 4 on the table. They're not perfect. You know, they, as Ivan was saying, you know, they all have their own particular quirks and flaws. But for us, they do manage to capture different aspects of the problem, and kind of when you view it in combination, you know, you do get a sense of where the problem is most significant. So kind of pre-pandemic, with these figures, we're kind of estimating that somewhere between 50 to 80 million households were in energy poverty, with these kind of so-called consensual or kind of subjective indicators picking up quite a lot of issues within Central, Eastern and Southern Europe, and then the kind of expenditure indicators picking up higher rates in kind of Western and Northern European countries. But we know that this is, you know, likely an underestimation of the problem, especially now with pandemic and gas price rises and so on. And we know we're not capturing all of the aspects of the problem. So this is why also quite a consistent theme of work and kind of lobbying over the years has been just calling for better data infrastructure. For me, that's a huge issue that we're facing. You know, and myself and Stefan and other colleagues, we've published a number of kind of working papers and journal articles where we've set out where there are big gaps and what kind of a alternative survey could look like. You know, things like heat waves and cooling issues, better understanding of individual energy practices, understanding of kind of the health and well-being aspects as well. And for me, that's kind of the point I'll end on, is that I think without this data and without this wider conceptualization of it, you know, we're not going to be able to truly achieve a kind of inclusive energy transition, because we're missing people right now. They're getting left behind and kind of falling between the cracks. So I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, but I would start again from you for the second round of questions in order to rotate. And actually, you already mentioned some of the points we would like to address in the second round, which is the evolution of the overall situation in terms of both poverty and insecurity in the field of energy during and due to the pandemic. As we know, it was last year, the crisis that started was not just a health-related crisis, of course. It was also social and economic related, and it was not just a crisis on the demand side, but also on the supply side, so also affecting the possibility to adequately invest in infrastructure. So you also told us that you started developing this COVID energy map. What's happening after and during the COVID crisis with energy-related issues?
Yeah, no, that's yeah, a really good question. I'll pop open my slides again so I can share the map. Yeah, so we have what we've called the COVID-19 energy map. Again, there's kind of a URL there and QR code. This is something that has been part of the Engager project that Stefan mentioned a bit earlier on. So there's quite a few colleagues from across kind of Spain, Netherlands, and France, and myself. We started this kind of last year just to see, you know, what kind of emergency measures were being adopted worldwide, and I think we've got almost kind of 500 different examples of policies now. So our map, this is a screenshot from maybe a month or so ago actually, so it's probably slightly different now. It's always constantly changing, which is a bit of a problem. But what we really found was there's been this huge concerted effort, you know, in terms of regulators, energy companies, governments, all kind of rushing to put in place quite a wide-ranging set of policies and kind of protections. So we've got bans on disconnections, you know, energy discounts, delayed payment schemes, rollout of you know, kind of microgrids. It's been slightly less of a focus, but you know, really cool examples like countries, you know, certain states of the US, in North Macedonia, in Colombia. Consumers who have always been historically disconnected from electricity have, you know, due to unpaid bills, have now been reconnected without paying a connection fee. So the latest figures I saw in Colombia is that it was around 15,000 households in one city in kind of the north had been reconnected to electricity. So yeah, really interesting work going on. As I mentioned, it's a really kind of fast changing situation. But I think what is interesting, if you look at this map, is kind of spatial divide that starts to kind of become clear. And we've got this kind of big hole at the top of Europe that we always like to point out. So I think, you know, it probably isn't a fair statement to say that everyone is focused on energy, because clearly within Nordic countries there's been more of a focus on income support, on maintaining employment, those different aspects instead. But I think overall kind of our summary, and we've recently published a paper on this, is that you know, clearly the pandemic and the kind of policy responses to it has created this hugely different landscape for addressing energy poverty. You know, it's not comparable to even a year ago, 2 years ago, and in part that's really because, you know, there has been this sort of conscious or unconscious, you know, shift towards recognizing basically the right to energy, that it is a fundamental need for everyone. It has been so critical for people accessing health information during the pandemic, who have been able to work and study from home. So we think that's really catalyzed quite a movement behind these rights to energy. But we have been quite concerned about how unsustainable a lot of these policies have been. So there's obviously mainly a reliance on kind of existing infrastructure on fossil fuels, very few examples of micro renewables being used. And I think, sort of touching really on your question there of, you know, what kind of comes next, this is a big concern of ours. This is kind of big cliff edge that's been created with a lot of these policies. They're kind of time limited, they're mostly linked to the pandemic kind of being formally declared as over. You know, what happens at the end of this with all the kind of financial pressures that have built up for many households? You know, there's a lot of energy debt that is accruing. yeah, I think that's going to be a big issue. And of course, then in terms of suppliers as well, this is all focusing on households, but we know that there's huge ongoing solvency issues with all of these policies have been costing energy companies a lot. You know, all of the delayed payments, there's cash flow issues, and I think, you know, that's then been compounded by the gas price rises recently, and certainly in the UK we seem to have been particularly vulnerable to this issue. You know, we've had more than 20 suppliers go bust since January. Just this week, my own energy supplier went into kind of special measures, so I've been like frantically, you know, just taking meter readings every day, and so it's, yeah, really strange times. I think it creates a very different context. I think just to end, I think to me that suggests a need to really stop and critically reflect on market liberalisation, and to think about, you know, are there alternatives that might be more appropriate moving forward, you know, particularly the role of municipalities and maybe owning local energy companies, or thinking about, you know, decentralization to local communities even. So I'm involved with the Horizon 2020 project on community energy. So we started a few months ago, but yeah, it's thousands of examples at a local level where people are coming together in their communities, and they've got some really exciting models of alternative energy provisioning, and in ways that don't involve subsidies. So I think that was mentioned earlier on. You know, they're showing it is viable to roll out, say, solar PV and not have to require government support on that. So yeah, I'll finish on that point there.
Thanks. You also anticipated some of the issues we're going to discuss in the next and final question. So the one about policies, which Ivan will address for first. But now I come back again to Stefan just to ask his take about what's happening now and what has been happening since the pandemic outbreak. And I in particular would ask him to let us understand if there were more poor and insecure people after the pandemic. So what's going on? Is this share of people increasing? What's happening?
Thank you. Yeah, this is really interesting in terms of the question of what are we going to, you know, what is the pool of vulnerabilities that we're seeing. And I just shared a policy briefing that the Engager Network published, where we sort of discussed the question of who is vulnerable right now. So I haven't done any recent research on this, so I can only speak from the experience of what happened before, and I can only speak from the experience of the kinds of policies that existed before, and I think what then puts certain countries in a better position than others. I thought I was listening to what the other speakers were saying. I think it's really interesting to get their perspectives on how we measure, how we approach this phenomenon. And indeed, I think we're now entering a fairly problematic phase at the European level, where I think our ability to measure and to follow energy poverty might become curtailed, because, and I know this from the Observatory, it was incredibly difficult, even just for the few years that we worked, to just get all of that data and process it and put it out there, beyond what sort of the very basic headline indicators that Eurostat collects, like you know, are you able to afford keeping your home adequately warm, or are you paying your bills on time? And here I think that we have so many problems in that all of these indicators, and Harriet really alluded to this, and also we got that very strongly from Ivan, all of these indicators measure slightly different things or show slightly different things. They really reflect, like always with lies and statistics, they almost reflect the question more than what's happening. You know, because if you ask people, even how you ask the question, are you able to keep your home adequately warm, can have very dramatic impacts on the answer you get. But what's really crucial, and I've been trying to highlight this since this happened, is that there's lots of evidence to show this, and we have it from the UK, and we did similar work in Hungary where we showed that. My colleague Sergio Terrado has shown it for Spain, is that when you take all of these indicators, and I've done that also in Poland with multidimensional indicators, what happens is when you put them together, the demographics of those indicators don't overlap. So in fact, what we're getting is a much bigger pool of households that are vulnerable by simply on at least one of those dimensions, sometimes two, than you would normally get from income poverty. So if we say, for example, that in the European Union, we have about, at least according to the latest data, we have about 90 or so million people who are at risk of poverty and social exclusion. That's primarily an income-based measure. Then if we look at some of what these other indicators were showing, one of our expenditure indicators, the twice the median expenditure indicators, which show basically a disproportionately high energy burden in household budgets. That indicator brought us to around 70 million people. The other indicators brought us to lower numbers, from 30 to 40 to 60 for the latest years I'm talking about. But if you start bringing those together, just those four, which we think are of relative robustness and they can give us some sense of what's happening, we're going to go well beyond 90. And that makes sense because we know that the number of people who are vulnerable to energy poverty is higher than the number of people who are income poor. That is always the case because there are additional reasons why people might be energy poor other than low incomes. And I think that's the problem we have now. We need a system that can ideally allow us to, at the micro level, work together in a multidimensional sense so we can see these overlapping vulnerabilities. And I don't, I can do more, we can do all kinds of modeling. I've not done it, but I'm sure, and I'm in another project where they're doing this now with elasticities, which has problems, by the way. But even just with that, with the prices rises we're seeing now, we're going to see whatever that figure is, if it's 70 or if it's 30 or 40, I'm certain that we're going to see an increase of at least 5–10% on an expenditure basis. I don't know, but I think that's probably a likely consequence. I don't know how much time I had. I want to talk a little bit about the policy setting, but maybe I can leave it for the next round of discussion. Just the one thing I do want to say at this stage is that for me, the best approach, so expenditure measures are very good and they show us where there are indicators of a problem. But for me, the best approach, and this is where we don't have enough data robustness, nor for that matter, very good tools, is to really understand circumstances, material and social, based on the definition that I described, where people are struggling. I think that, so because different things can happen with expenditure, and also expenditure doesn't necessarily reflect the level of energy service that people get. But we have to be able to understand what the level of energy service that people get is, and in that regard, how that connects to the material conditions and the social conditions of a household. We were starting to open that up when we started to get these indicators about whether there is rot in window frames and whether there's mold in the house and whether there is, what was the other one? Rot in window frames, leaking roof. Now, when you have these sort of things, they're not directly telling you that it's energy poverty, but they are objective indicators. They reflect on what is happening in the house that also tell you that there is a problem with the energy efficiency in the house. Now, that's not a perfect score, but there are ways I think we can start talking about these things that are going to talk about the effects. For example, how many rooms in your home are being heated or not in a cold day and things like that. That's starting to open the question of what are the material implications of this phenomenon on everyday life. And that's where we should start in our measurements. That's my strong view. And I think when we create that evidence base, we will be able to see, if we start to do it on a long-term basis, we're going to be able to see what happens on a sort of more panel-based approach.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks also for waiting a little bit before adding some points related to the next question. In the case of Ivan Fayel, I would merge the question you already answered and the next one. So he, as I already anticipated, he will be the first to address the issue of the policy. So I just would like to ask Ivan whether he has some more updated information related to the evolution of the situation in terms of data and measurement. What's his take about the cliff edge that Harriet highlighted before? So if we are experiencing a sort of transitory phase or a permanent phase in terms of a costly measure to sustain and support vulnerable people emerging from the pandemic. And then attached to this, I would start with the final round related to the policy. So what should we do basically to improve the way we try to contrast this phenomenon, as said also by our director before, and as already mentioned by Harriet Thompson. We have to rethink something in terms of economic modeling, economic theory, and economic approach.
Hey, it's an easy task, no? No, I mean, I'm trying to continue the discussion that Stephen started. The point in particular that actually I'm going to present some results where we try to estimate the elasticity of energy use to prices. The issue here again is the lack of data, because I mean we don't have data on energy use, so we have to estimate data at the micro level at least. So in Italy we are lucky because we have very detailed data on energy expenditure. We can have prices, we can try to derive some kind of energy use estimates, maybe calibrating this data with aggregate information that we have from, for example, from PEFA accounts of Eurostat accounts on physical energy accounts for sectors. But first, I would like to close the first session. Your point was what's going to happen in the future. In the future, I think as the very nice work of Alex showed us, we have two issues together. No, the COVID scars, the effects of the pandemic. Some effects are going to be shown to medium terms. We don't know. Plus the transition, because on top of that we have the transition, and we are seeing, unfortunately, these days that these things can somehow overlap, because the very lucky effects of the rebound of the economy while the supply was struggling a bit to develop is showing the world that change, the energy transition is not going to be sudden, because there are no such a thing as quick transition. Energy transitions are characteristics of all the history of human beings, but they never been quick. They are long, because you need to change everything. You need to change the way, the fuel you're using, the primary movers you're using, the infrastructure, and you also have to change preferences. Think about, for example, electric vehicles. I don't think that the low uptake of electric vehicles is just a matter of of technological issues. Also, it's a matter of preferences of people that maybe like to drive different cars. They are going to be to be convinced and somehow get used to that new technology. And so on COVID scars, I would say, I mean, there are some obvious effects that is probably this is going to increase the probability of being out of the job market. There was a recent analysis that showed us that this thing is not going to be just a short-term effect, but can be permanent, because once you're out, for some categories of workers, once you're out, are probably going to be out forever. So this thing is going to change. So the probability of being in the job market and the probability to earn income. So this is going to be an issue in terms of income earners. Obviously, increase the fragility of the households that were vulnerable before. Think about the use of digital connection, the possibility of having internet. That means the ability to work if you're doing smart working, and the ability of go to school and to have education if you are a student. And again, this disconnection in the use of remote education, this is the case at least for Italy, is going definitely to increase school drops and also to affect the future employability of the people that is subject to this scars. Lastly, there is also, this is not a scar, this is change of the pattern, the way we are using energy. I mean, if the share of smart working is going to increase, this is going to affect, luckily, I would say, for example, the energy used for private transportation or for public transportation as well, but it's going to in the minus sense. So you are going to maybe to use less your car for going to work. I mean, there are studies that are showing, for example, that you can substitute the use of energy for work because for leisure. I mean, so it's not clear that the net effects is going to have less energy for transport. But I mean, at least I think it's reasonable that within the cities you're going to have less traffic and less pollution and also less energy use. But this can increase the amount of energy you're using at home. This is going to change the energy mix this is one of the few effects that is going in the right direction. It's going hand in hand with the transition, because if you're using more electricity, for example, and less liquid fuel for transport, this is going to be good, because usually you can increase the amount of renewables or low carbon sources within the grid. So this is not going to be in contrast. Then there is the challenge of the energy transition. This is a different story, because we show, I mean, I think I showed before that it's clear that there is a pattern between the effect of energy prices, energy expenditure, and how energy expenditure is different across the income and expenditure distribution. That's, if you want, it's a root, at least in the economic sense for economists, of energy poverty. The transition is going to affect energy prices. I mean that's obvious through carbon taxation, if we're going to go for the carbon taxation, to the fact that when we have to switch to different kind of fuels, we have to pay for the new infrastructure, we have to pay for the stranded infrastructure. I mean, that's a fact of life. So we have to be ready to that, and I think it's rather disingenuous for policymakers that are selling easily the transition in terms of, everybody's going to stay better. That's not true, and so it's not. I don't think it's serious for them to sell that kind of points. Median households are going to be more exposed to carbon pricing. I'm going to show in a while. There's a paper from me and Luciano Lavecchia. We did exactly what Stefan was mentioning before. We estimate for different kind of households in terms of kind of household and position within the expenditure distribution, the reaction to carbon taxation affecting the price of liquid fuels, of heating, and of electricity. So there is a reaction in terms of quantity. You are on average reducing the reaction, the quantities, but this is different across these characteristics. And then we can build a new, if you want, counterfactual energy expenditure and see how these things affects, for example, who is going to suffer most in terms, for example, reduce of energy demand in quantity terms, the reduce of total household expenditure. I'm going to show you some graph in a while. And vulnerable households in general are more exposed to climate policies, but at the same time are also more exposed to climate impacts. There is I think, huge issues that we just now are starting to investigate. There is not just energy poverty in terms of fuel poverty, so in terms of having enough heating services, but having enough cooling services in some part of the countries, like the southern part of the countries, also some part of Italy, for example, in the northeast, where you are going to have hotter and hotter summer. And we know that one of the major impacts of climate change, at least in the Mediterranean, is exactly the impact in increasing the mortality because of. And this is going to change the way you are using energy, because more and more houses are going to ask more power for powering their cooling equipments, and it's going to change also the price of electricity, because at the same time, unfortunately, for example, if you have water stress during the summer, you are going to affect also the energy mix. You are going to have less hydro. Hydro is a very cheap source to produce energy. Say, if you have to substitute hydro with other energy sources that are more expensive, your energy bill is going to increase. Just to show you, how complex is this stuff. These are some of the results of the paper I was talking before. So we are simulating different level of carbon tax. You can see the red line is a 50 euro per ton carbon tax, and the blue lines are 100 euro per tax. You can see the effects. 99 is the total households, while 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the fifth of expenditure distribution. And you can see that electricity demand is reduced more in proportion by poorest households. Heating demand is reduced more by more affluent households in proportion. Transport fuels, again, is reduced more by less affluent households. But here it's tricky, because you should condition somehow this. As I said before, you remember that there is more than 25% of households that have zero demand for fuel. So that's is not going to affect them, obviously. But if you can see that if you look at the total energy demand in quantity, the guys that are reducing more the demand are the poorest one. If you translate this demand in terms of quantity in euros, so this is the expenditure effect you have on the left, the 50 and 100, we simulated also very high carbon taxes like 200 and 800 carbon taxation. You see that total expenditure is going to be higher for less affluent households. So the effects of a climate policy in terms of carbon taxation is going to affect more to change the budget more of vulnerable houses, as I said before. So that's an issue, because you should somehow compensate these guys. Because if you want to have a just transition, you cannot imagine that this all the biggest chunk of the cost of this transition is going to be paid by less affluent households, because you are going to increase. And this, in a sense, is also to underline what Stefan was saying. That's the reason why we are talking about energy poverty. Because if this is not the case, we can talk about poverty and that's all. I mean, we don't need to have a specific focus on energy, but a specific focus on energy, I think, is from one side, from what Stefan said, energy use and services are a different part of the story, are completely different from other services. So it's important to have a focus on that. And secondly, because of the transition, we know that the economic stress that we are posing on households is going to increase. So it should be clear to the policymaker that this is going to be the fact, because it's important they're going to design their policies according in a smart way, to try to minimize this effect, to recycle the eventual revenues, for example, for carbon taxation, or intervene on another, on another levels. And then I switch to the, if you want, to the beginning of the next and last session, the one regarding policies. And if energy poverty is a mix of high prices, low income, low expenditure, but also, if we discuss the quality of the infrastructure, the quality of dwellings, the quality of the appliance you're using to convert energy, to convert energy in a useful way. I mean, from these different aspects, you can have a set of policies. So, as I said before, energy poverty is going to be reduced if you increase income, if you have any higher energy efficiency of buildings and appliances, if you have a higher education, because you can process easily information, for example, your transaction cost as less. So you are informed by the fact that, for example, there are some kind of tax reduction to increase the energy efficiency of your building. And also, there is also a fact that is well known that for homeowners have more control, for example, on their appliance, on the structure of their dwelling, and so they can intervene more easily than home renter. At the same time, energy poverty increase with energy price, increase when prices that are competing with energy, in a sense, food, some other basic services the households need, increase with the ability of the household to access credit. I want to revamp my house, but honestly, I cannot sustain that upfront cost. So being credit constrained is going to, and unfortunately, we know pretty well that this heavily depends on your income. In Italy, I would say also on the fact that you are an asset owner somehow. But also that's not just that simple, because there are other stuff that are, for example, behavior, our knowledge, as before. So you can imagine some kind, that's important, because there are some policy levels like a sort of nudge towards, I don't know, energy efficiency, a certain attitude towards energy bill, knowing better how your energy is priced, for example. What are the policies in Italy? I think that across Europe are rather similar. If you want to reduce the price or the energy bill, you can imagine a kind of discount in your energy bill. And this is what we call bonus gas and bonus electricity. So let's say poor households, but the point is how you define a poor households can receive that kind of discounts. How defined in Italy is according to an indicator that mix somehow income and assets. If you want, and also the household size. And that's tricky, because these things is pretty expensive. And if you don't target well your bonuses, you run the risk that there are really vulnerable households that are paying for not really vulnerable households. Now, in a sense, this mechanism can induce new energy poverty. So what is surprising me is not that we have these policies, but that we don't have a single evaluation of the effectiveness of these policies. We try to do that using simulations, because unfortunately we don't have access to the data, and that's rather an unfortunate event, but it's common across for many other different policies in Italy, unfortunately, I think also for Europe. I mean, these things are not working pretty well, because the issue is the targeting. Then you have what is called the eco bonus, so a kind of discount in your tax declaration if you improve the energy efficiency of your house, of your appliances. These things is cost an enormous amount of money, and again, it's not clear what are the benefits in terms of environmental benefits, energy use, and honestly, I don't think it's difficult to state that it's a super regressive measures, because it's just for homeowners. It's just for homeowners. They have an amount of income that is high enough to be, that they pay a significant amount of taxation that they can deduct. So that's not the thing I would go for reduce energy poverty. Then there are fiscal subsidies. That's also I go back to the point that was mentioned before by Franco. I mean, I wouldn't say that that people doesn't like subsidies. Maybe economists doesn't like subsidies, but politicians, they love subsidies, because I mean they somehow hide all the costs, in the small. But we have the fiscal subsidies for both electricity and gas. What are the, I mean, here we have the evaluation again, is the same paper I was mentioning before with Luciano. We simulated the households that are getting the bonus and the households that are energy poor according to our definition. And as you can see in this table, just a small chunk of these two phenomena overlap. So there is most of the energy poor that they are not targeted by the bonus. This was all done by the simulation, but lately for 2020, we had the data on actual people that is getting the bonus, and it's incredible. It's the miracle of statistics. The number is more or less the same. That's in the hypothesis that our energy poor indicator is a good indicator, and that's not, I mean, with all the caveats that we used before. And this is a kind of counterfactual. This is the percentage, the effects of energy poor households with and without the bonus. So if we imagine that we have to pay the bonus to the households, how much is going to change the energy poor? And you see it's really marginal. I mean, it's doing something, but given the cost, it is around 300 million per year. Is I don't think that's a big effect. Then try to, I say, this is not working, this is not working, this is not working. That's very easy, because I'm a researcher. I'm not, working for the government. What I would say that is super useful, I would say that improving the quality of social housing should be the first move. I mean, people that is living in social housing, that's for sure. I mean, they are targeted, no, because they had that house for a given reason, and the quality of social housing in Italy is super poor. There are very old buildings. So refurbishing social housing, use more that nudging point that I was making before, for example. Also using, if you want, that kind of social approach that Harriet was mentioning before, like, energy communities, this kind of stuff, where people can learn how to save energy and best use energy, where people can learn that sometimes very simple tricks can reduce the amount of energy you're using, for example, during the winter. It's a great way to go. But the point that you have to be there. I mean, it's not enough that you are setting a super nice and sparkling websites, because, I mean, I give you a news, the poor people, they don't have maybe access to the websites, or they don't know how to read that information. So you have to be there, or you have to do with the social assistance, you have to be on the territory to speak with the people. The examples of Aries were fantastic, just to know and imagining what you cannot know now, what's the situation, and to be, using very small steps. And maybe you can learn that you don't need that much of resources to do that kind of, of policies. No, it's not a matter of having billions of euros, but it's to be in the right place, to have the right information, and to design the policy as smartly as you can.
Thanks a lot for this rich picture and for already addressing the last and maybe the most complex point of the discussion. I would ask now how Harriet and Stefan to add their take, as what they were already doing before. So I would ask them to a little bit enlarge what they were saying before. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting talk there by Ivan, and I think I'm going to take that further a bit more, but make it a little bit more generalized. So I think thinking from kind of a social policy perspective, you know, there's so many different ways in which energy poverty policies can be exclusionary. So I think one trend that we've seen across Europe is this drive for kind of policies and measures to be directed towards what are termed vulnerable consumers. And kind of in principle, it seems, you know, a fair approach. But I know, you know, from what the research that exists, in practice, it is quite problematic in kind of two main ways. So I think on the one hand, because that often is a really large group. So, for example, the legal definition in the UK of a vulnerable consumer includes all young children, includes all elderly people, includes all people with disabilities. So that's, when you add those all together, that's pretty much, it's the majority of the population. So we then see that there can be some imprecision in the targeting that's introduced, and often means that the easiest to reach households are targeted first at the expense of harder to reach groups with, say, more complex circumstances. So, you know, we've seen this, for example, with energy efficiency policies, really going for that low-hanging fruit of, you know, let's change the tap filters, put new light bulbs in, but not address the kind of difficult stuff of, you know, external wall cladding, for example. And I think, you know, on the other hand, there's always this kind of political imaginary of what a vulnerable consumer is, and certainly with the research that Stefan and I have been involved in, you know, that really includes young adults, and despite the fact that, you know, nearly always they're in quite precarious situations, be that about the housing quality or the transitional phase of their life. So certainly that kind of vulnerable consumer framing has been quite problematic in many ways. Secondly, just for the reasons that we've already picked out across this session, that, you know, different indicator set pick up different vulnerabilities, but also there's a huge amount of power behind who's making that decision, and you know, the kind of discourses that promotes thereafter. And we've seen in countries where there's a very established framework for measuring energy poverty, such as in the UK or in Ireland and kind of in France, you know, you end up getting very technical and detailed manipulation of indicators to kind of reach a desired outcome. So we see that with in the past with the kind of in the UK, whether we measure income before or after housing costs, whether we equivalize it or we don't equivalize it, you know, that flips around the situation, whether you're picking up large families with lots of children, or if you're picking up elderly, maybe single adult elderly families. And then I think there's a lot of risks that come from the kind of natural desire for simple policy tools. So it's a point that's come up a couple of times already. And there's a lot of risks around data flattening, the way in which we kind of seek out to the kind of average. And that does then exclude kind of diverse expressions of these kind of different forms of vulnerability. And that's particularly something in some work that I'm doing in Latin America, where we've been looking at, been doing a lot of kind of qualitative community level work around what kinds of energy services are important to people. And of course, every country is different types of, you know, equipment and things that are coming out is important. So in Mexico, having a blender for making sauce is super important. It's really culturally important. And, you know, something like 99% of families own a blender, but things like that won't be in kind of measuring frameworks, and in turn, you know, it's not kind of counted towards like electricity usage and so on. I think the last kind of point I make is around, again, that targeting. It's that constantly that challenge between, you know, to reach a precision of targeting is expensive. It does cost a lot to kind of means test, especially when you're talking about income or other kind of complicated dimensions. So I think, you know, we know that in response, a lot of governments do rely on kind of qualifying benefits, or what might be called passport benefits. So it can be things like welfare support, you know, kind of unemployment or disability related support. And this is like a second-hand form of judging eligibility to energy poverty measures. And, you know, that again, it can lead to really poor targeting support, and it just ends up reproducing some of the inequalities that already exist in that those kind of passport benefits. So most famously in the UK, you know, we have a winter fuel allowance, and that is automatically paid to everyone who is over the age of 60 if they receive a state pension. So that's regardless of income. So you have some really wealthy families in the UK get paid this this benefit related to fuel usage, and it's, you know, it's probably one of the most inefficient energy poverty support schemes that I can think of kind of across the world. So then I guess, yeah, in terms of how do we increase that effectiveness, well, again, it does come back to that data and thinking really holistically about what is energy poverty, what does it encompass, but also you know, what are the drivers of people not being able to secure kind of, you know, adequate energy services, and then in turn thinking how can we design policies in a way that actually addresses those root causes instead of the kind of symptoms. And I think that's where a lot of policies in Europe have been quite problematic and have failed, really, that they're focusing on the end consequences of it. You know, it's a sticking plaster for you know, much wider set of issues that do require some quite drastic and systemic changes. And like Ivan was saying around, you know, the quality of the housing stock, you know, our infrastructure and just the kind of energy market arrangement. So yeah, there's some big challenges there, you know, kind of working cross-sectorally, getting different actors to communicate to one another, negotiating the challenges of kind of data sharing, especially with, you know, GDPR, and a lot of data is held by private companies and they don't want to share that. So lots of different issues to unpick there, but it does need that kind of broad holistic oversight, I think.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. And I think we can to Stefan for the very last speech of today's session, and then I will just add a couple of words in order to thank you again and conclude.
Yeah, thank you. It's very hard to add anything to this. Both Harriet and Ivan have been very comprehensive, and I really enjoyed finding out the results of this analysis that Ivan was presenting, but also Harriet's points on how we're broadening this out. I will mention very briefly something that actually Harriet was also involved in, a paper that we published earlier in the year that's coming out of partly of work within the EU Energy Poverty Observatory. I'm just trying to share my screen. It's not showing. Let me try again. So that has a sort of matrix. There it is now. I should be able to see it. Has a kind of matrix that gives you, that basically tries to categorize and open the space for understanding where deficiencies are and where the problems are. And we looked at the national energy action plans, and we looked at around, I think, 13 different elements of energy poverty policy, whether there was any recognition of the problem, a definition, whether there were indicators, direct policies, indirect policies, whether there were any best practices identified, any local, etc., etc. And so we then categorize, this paper is published in Energy, so I'm just giving you the URL there. So then we categorize these policies along two axes, roughly corresponding to the principles of procedural and distributional justice. Distributional justice being anything that involves what we call access to resources. So people's ability to improve their financial, material, or any other kind of situation, and to what extent there are policies that address that. And the other axis is what we call access to justice, where it's really the procedural and recognition aspect, where people have access to policies, measures, but also acts of political recognition that do address their circumstances. So we looked at all of the NECPs and we gave us some very basic scores. We said, is the policy present, or maybe is it just partly present, or is it missing for all these domains? And then we sort of added them together. I know it's a very crude analysis and it's just very, very broad, but maybe it starts to give you a space of where different countries lie in these different quadrants. Because ideally, I guess you want to be in the space where you're addressing both the distributional and the procedural dimension. But I think what I think is more challenging, even if you're not addressing both, is to be addressing the procedural dimension, because it's actually easier to throw resources at households and easier to implement policies than to design robust decision-making mechanisms and democratic and inclusive participatory processes. I think it's more challenging to do that. So it was quite interesting for us to see where countries were on this axis. The overwhelming number of countries in the EU did not fare well on either of these two axes. There were some countries like France and Lithuania and Estonia and Spain and Belgium that did well on both. I have to say, this is declarative commitments. This is not actually policies on the ground. If you start measuring policies on the ground, you might get a very different picture. And then it was interesting to see which countries did well on that sort of procedural element, where you had countries that like Romania and Cyprus, but also Austria, Finland, but we're really expecting those countries to have more robust, at least procedural mechanisms, versus those who did better on the distributional axis, where it was something like countries like Poland, Croatia, Italy, interestingly, performing better on the distributional axis, not so much on the procedural. Bulgaria, Greece, countries that have some of the highest rates of energy poverty, strong distributional policies, not so well on the procedural dimension. So I think maybe this gives us a sense of where we should be going in terms of policies, and we have to, in my view, I think we really have to make sure that more countries at least are on this side, certainly we convert everything here, but then we also have policies that are strong in terms of enabling people to access formal and informal mechanisms of justice. There was just one aspect in the transition that I wanted to bring out. I think that comes through. I would say there's at least 4 things that we need to look at in future policies. There's the question of data, not just enough data on all of these things, but also data along particular axes. The question of ethnicity, for example, the question of gender, the question of space cooling, transport, how we measure subnational categories. And finally, this really, for me, interesting dilemma of whether we're always going to have relative or absolute measures, and what it might look like to start working with somewhat more absolute measures as opposed to relative income measures is really interesting for me. How this connects to the wider nexus around transport, urban planning. It's interesting that the EU is bringing in proposals that are starting to open this, but also questions around cooperation, participation, and more broadly with just transition. I noticed a comment that the Fit for 55 starts to think about energy poverty in quite a more sophisticated way, but how this translates into policy will be for me, very interesting, partly because also you do have the subsidiarity principles, which means that at least in the context where I work, I find that there's really not a lot of take-up of any of this among sectors other than energy, which is a kind of strange place for this to go. I mean, of course, it's energy poverty, but a lot of it is about housing and social policy. It's about health, and those sectors are underrepresented in the debate as a whole. So yeah, that's all I just wanted to say, and thank you again for inviting us. Maybe, I don't know if there's any more questions. There were some really interesting ones in the chat. I don't know if there's any more people want to raise. It'd be great to talk if possible.
Yes, thanks, and thanks also for exactly addressing already the questions in the chat. There was just another question which required to have a specific focus on the aspect of energy poverty in Africa, but I guess this will require another huge effort in terms of discussion. We are running a little bit out of time. And as I said before, I would like to thank again both the participants for attending the whole webinar, and you as guests and speaker for animating the discussion. I just want to add a couple of things about the insights that you provided us today, independently, of course, from the specific features and aspects that we saw today. I guess that an important issue that emerged is the need, also in terms of, also for researchers who have in a way the ambition to inspire and influence the public debate and policies to try to merge both qualitative and quantitative aspects in terms of observational data, in terms of studies. And also, I think we should remember that the social construction of the problem is something really influential in terms of both definition, measurement, and also as a consequence policy. So I guess that we had a methodological set of insights too today. Thanks again for your participation. You can follow all our activities as Turing School of Regulation, Fondazione Parlamente on our social media channels and on our website, turingschool.eu. And hope to see you again in the next future.